All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most extreme, almost unbelievable economic collapses in modern history, the hyperinflation of Zimbabwe. We're going to figure out how a country's money can become so worthless that its banknotes literally need 14 zeros. So let's just jump in at the craziest point.
Take a look at this number, 89.7 sextillion%. That was the actual peak annual inflation rate in Zimbabwe in the middle of November 2008. I mean, it's a number so huge it barely feels real, more like something from a physics textbook. But the reality behind it was absolutely devastating.
And just to put that in perspective, this wasn't just bad inflation. This was the second worst case of hyperinflation ever recorded in all of human history. The only time it was worse was in Hungary right after World War II. We are talking about a complete and total meltdown of a country's money. So what did that number actually mean for people on the ground? It meant that prices were doubling every 24 hours. Just imagine that. You get paid in the morning, and by the next morning, that money is worth half of what it was. Money became this hot potato that you had to get rid of the second you touched it.
So this begs the huge question, how on earth does this happen? How does a nation's currency, a symbol of its identity and its economy, just unravel into total absurdity? This isn't just a simple story about printing too much money. It's about a whole decade of decisions that led to this sextillion% problem.
So let's start right at the peak of that chaos, in late 2008. This is when the zeros on the banknotes couldn't even keep up with how fast they were losing value. This was, of course, the era of the famous $100 trillion note.
The numbers from this time are just mind-boggling. The monthly inflation rate hit almost 80 billion%. You had a $100 trillion note that could barely get you a bus ticket. And the situation got so completely out of control that the government, they just stopped telling people what the inflation rate was. They basically tried to hide the scale of the collapse.
To really understand how Zimbabwe got to this point, we have to hit the rewind button. Because this story of collapse doesn't begin with poverty. No, it starts from a position of incredible economic promise.
It is really hard to imagine now, but right after independence in 1980, the Zimbabwe dollar was actually stronger than the US dollar. The country was known as the breadbasket of Africa. It had a powerful agricultural sector, a solid manufacturing base. This quote just captures how incredibly far the country fell.
The first real crack started to show up in 1997. There was a massive, completely unbudgeted payment to war veterans that crashed the currency literally overnight. That was followed by a super costly military adventure in the Congo, which drained the country's reserves. And then, in 2000, came the policy that would prove to be the final, decisive blow.
And that brings us to something called the Fast-Track Land Reform Program. Now, while the stated political goal was to correct some colonial-era land imbalances, the economic consequence was just a shockwave that completely dismantled the country's ability to produce things. The seizure of commercial farms led to a catastrophic collapse in production across the board. The country's GDP shrank by 40%. Food production fell by almost half. Manufacturing output just dropped off a cliff, and unemployment soared to an estimated 80%. The country's entire economic engine was fundamentally broken.
So with the economy in a total freefall and its tax base completely wiped out, the government was trapped. Its solution? Just turn on the printing press. And this is where we enter what the central bank governor himself would later call the casino economy.
This is a concept known as the inflation tax. See, when a government can no longer raise money through normal taxes, it can just print it. But here's the thing, it's not free money. Every new dollar that gets printed devalues all the other dollars already out there, which acts like a hidden, silent tax on the savings of every single citizen. And you don't have to take my word for it. In a pretty stunning admission, the man who was actually in charge of the Reserve Bank, Gideon Gano, used these exact words to describe the mess he was presiding over. It wasn't about sound economic policy anymore. It was pure speculation and survival, day by day. Then, in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, the government made a classic fatal error. It basically declared inflation illegal and forced price controls on businesses. But, you can't just outlaw economics. Forcing shops to sell goods at a loss meant that shelves went empty overnight. Everything just moved to the black market, where the prices were even higher, which only fed the very inflation they were trying to stop. And behind all these abstract, crazy numbers are millions of real human stories. For example, there's the story of a midwife whose entire monthly salary $1 billion at the time, became so worthless so quickly that she couldn't even afford the bus ride home from work. She had to walk for 3 hours. This was the daily reality for millions of people. So, in the aftermath, the Zimbabwe dollar was completely abandoned. But the ghost of that trillion-dollar note, it still haunts the nation. And it sparks this really fierce debate over who or what was truly to blame for it all.
You really get two dominant and totally conflicting stories. The government has consistently blamed international sanctions, arguing they were this Western plot designed to force regime change. But, on the other side, the international consensus, for the most part, points to internal mismanagement, the destruction of property rights, and just disastrous fiscal policies as the real drivers. They argue that sanctions didn't force the government to print money.
The end of the crisis came really abruptly. In 2009, the government just gave up. They officially allowed people to use foreign currencies, like the US dollar, a process called dollarization. And by letting a stable currency circulate, the effect was immediate. Hyperinflation just stopped, and store shelves started to fill up again.
Okay, but now, here's a truly ironic twist to the whole story. That worthless $100 trillion note, it became a hot collector's item. Between 2011 and 2016, its value as a novelty just soared by about 1,500%. It dramatically outperformed conventional investments like the FTSE 100 stock index. A symbol of total failure became a better investment than the stock market. You just can't make this stuff up.
And today, the trauma of 2008 is just so deeply imprinted that Zimbabweans remain incredibly skeptical of any local currency. The latest attempt, a so-called gold-backed currency called the ZiG that was launched in 2024, is already struggling. I mean, despite being backed by physical assets, it's lost most of its value on the black market, and about 85% of all transactions in the country are still done in US dollars.
And that really leaves us with this one final thought. The story of Zimbabwe shows that money is so much more than just paper, or even what backs it, like gold. At its core, it's a social contract. It's built on trust. And when an entire nation completely loses trust in its money, what's it actually worth? The answer, as Zimbabweans learn the hardest way possible, might just be zero.